Okay. Think I'm sure folks will continue to trickle in as needed, but in the interest of time, want to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining this evening or this afternoon or this morning or wherever you're coming from. In this case, it's my evening, but looking forward to the opportunity to talk with you all about what makes an ideal MBA resume. So my hope is that you all come away today with a few tips and tricks on how to tighten up your resume, how to avoid some of the pitfalls that I've seen frequently as a coach, and having been through the MBA process myself. Want to sure, or at least want to make sure that those who attend tonight are well equipped going forward, regardless of what stage you're in with respect to applications. So just to walk through what we're going to be going through today, I'm going to give just a quick introduction about me, talk to you a little bit about my background, my history with Leland, and what I tend to specialize in. Where they're going to go through some session goals. We're going to talk through some of the aspects of what makes a good MBA resume. Talk a little bit about structure. Going to give you just a couple examples to chew on as for some perspective of what makes a quality resume bullet point. And then I'm going to bring up an example resume, cover some things that work well in the example, and also some areas that are tend to be some of those common pitfalls that I mentioned. And then we'll leave some time at the end to go through any questions that you all might have with respect to resumes. So without further ado, I want to introduce myself. My name is Matt. I'm originally from the state of Virginia, born and raised, and from as you can see through my education, it doesn't look like I've left the state. Went to College of William and Mary for my undergrad. I was a history major, so for anyone out there that's a liberal arts major and is interested in pursuing business school, it can be done. And went on to eventually get my MBA from Darden. Before going back to business school, spent a number of years in consulting in the DC area, focused more in the healthcare and federal spaces, and then post MBA continued my career in consulting for a little bit, and am now back in healthcare, more on the strategy and business transformation side, working specifically for a large behavioral health plan, which I really appreciated the opportunity. It's allowed me to build on a lot of what I've learned in my time at Darden, and then subsequently in my time in consulting as well. Um, so what do I like to do in my spare time? Pretty passionate about music. I play in a couple cover bands local here in the DC area in my spare time. So if anyone's interested in music, love to hear it. And also have the opportunity to do coaching here through the Leland platform. So hopefully most of you by now are pretty familiar with what Leland offers, but have been really impressed as a coach utilizing the service. It's given me an opportunity to work with a number of different folks like yourselves through every stage of the MBA admissions process, from just figuring out where to start to resumes specifically, which tends to be one of my specific areas of expertise, through essays, to letters of recommendation, to interview prep. And then outside of MBA admissions, I also have a service in the consulting space. So if anyone's interested in getting some more preparation and help with all things case interviewing, it's also an area I focus on. One thing I wanted to call your attention to, if you haven't gathered it by now on the slide, uh, for those of you who are attending, you're in luck. I'm running a discount through the end of next week. Using the code up on the screen, you can get 5% off of all my services. And I'll talk a little bit about those offerings at the end. But just wanted to give you all the heads up that that discount will expire at the end of next week. So if you're interested in using it, we recommend jumping on it, excuse me, sooner rather than later. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, talking a little bit about what I'm hoping you all take away from today, I want to make sure we have a clear understanding on the differences between your MBA application resume and your job resume. I think the one primary mistake I see a lot of folks make with respect to their applications is they tend to just take their existing resume and just copy paste right into the application and send that. There are a few nuances between the two resumes that I want to make sure you all have a better understanding of, and we talk through a little bit more specifically. I'm going to talk through some of the key components and structure of the MBA resume. Again, there's a little bit of art versus science to this. That some can be a matter of personal preference, but just going to give you, generally speaking, some of the primary components you're going to want to have factored into your resume. We're going to talk about what good looks like in terms of style and content, and then walk through a couple of examples of how to actually strengthen your MBA resume. So let's talk about first what makes a good resume. Uh, Most of this should be pretty straightforward. I'm assuming most of you on this call already have a resume, so uh, there shouldn't be anything that's too dissimilar from just a structural standpoint. Starting with style, want to make sure we have uh, good grammar, consistent formatting, and we're judicious when it comes to verbiage and vocabulary. Um, so, in terms of formatting and grammar, common mistakes I see: um, getting a little too liberal with borders, where we're stretching the boundaries of what's likely acceptable from an admissions perspective. Grammar, misspelled words, errant commas. Some bullets have periods, some bullets don't have periods. Um, this might sound nitpicky, but details matter. At the end of the day, if you're applying for a graduate business degree or frankly any graduate school program in general, especially having several years of work experience, the expectation is that you all are detail oriented to a degree. So these little things, and I'm going to show you some examples, can make or break an application. Um, Structure, we want to have clear, consistent flow from start to finish of your resume. You know, there's some preference between if you put your education first or your professional experience first. um, in some cases it doesn't really matter, we just want to make sure there's clear delineation. We've got a logical flow from top to bottom. Another component I want to mention on style, I've often seen resumes where people put in fancy graphics, photos of themselves, they overstyle it. Um, Simple is the key word here when we're going with the resume. And we want to make sure that we're leaving space on the page to tell your narrative, to highlight examples of leadership, to highlight examples of impact. And we don't want to forsake some of those things at the expense of having a profile photo or fancy shading and fancy fonts and fancy graphics. The expectation is we're delivering a pretty standard boilerplate resume with the quality content that an admissions reader would want to see from a prospective applicant. Um, so that touches into the content piece. Um, so talking from a structural standpoint, um, or sorry, more specific to content, and this is where I'm going to talk through some of the differences between an MBA and a job resume. I think for a lot of job resumes, they tend to read more like job descriptions, and much of that is by design and intentional. For example, if you've got a computer science background, you're working as a software developer, and you're applying for another software developer position or software engineer position, I think the expectation is that your resume has pretty standard job descriptor type bullets that a hiring manager or a recruiter would want to see. Probably specific jargon, specific vocab, um, standard boilerplate job description type bullets, to make sure that you're equipped to do the job that you're applying to. Now, the difference is we're applying for an MBA or any graduate admissions program for that matter. It is possible, if not more than likely, that your admissions reader has no idea what you do or is unfamiliar with the industry that you're a part of. So, if your resume is loaded with jargon or acronyms that are highly specific to your industry, an admissions reader might look at it and say, this might be impressive. The problem is I have no idea what it means. And I'm not getting any sense of what does this person actually do. And so then before you know it, you might find your resume in the bottom of the pile or disregarded and your application not given the due diligence that I would have want. Instead, what we want to highlight, and this is the primary difference between your standard job resume and your MBA resume. Um, and just as a quick interruption, I'm getting a little bit of feedback on the call. So just to make sure, if you're not on mute, please go on mute. Thank you. So key point of distinction, we want to highlight leadership and we want to highlight outcomes and results. Um, so you want to think of every bullet point. A common framework that's used, I don't recommend using it literally, but I think it's a good way to think about structuring your ideas, is the STAR method. So for those who are unfamiliar, the STAR method is situation, task, action, and result. So from a bullet point perspective, you should be telling me, what's the situation or task that was done, what actions were taken and what was the result. And specifically, I'm more interested as a reader in your role. So, what I would want to hear are examples of, when are times that you demonstrated impact, you took initiative, you solved a complex problem, you offered a new solution, um, or because of your efforts, your company, your team, your business achieved a tangible outcome. These are the things that readers are keying in on and want to look for in a resume. Is, at the end of the day, MBA programs aspire to take in and develop leaders, and so we want to see those examples of leadership throughout the resume, not just, frankly, a LinkedIn job description. So I see a question in the chat that's asking, can you expand on logical flow from top to bottom? Start with recency of work experiences and end with education. It's a good question. I think more specifically to work experience, yes, you want to start with your most recent. The last section or the last header in that subsection should be the furthest back in terms of history. Same thing with education. So in terms of logical flow, always start with your most recent. Good question. Okay, going to talk a little bit about structure here. Again, I want to mention there's some variability. There's not exactly one right structure in terms of section headings, et cetera. It's, there's a little bit of personal preference involved here, but I'm going to talk generally about what types of sections I might expect to see. Education's a fairly obvious one. In terms of MBA programs specifically, we want to be focusing on post-secondary, so university, community college, junior college, master's degree programs, etc. Um, Less interested in high school, particularly if we're looking for room there, or any pre-secondary education. Again, focus specifically on university education. We want to make sure we're calling out any scholarships, awards, campus involvement. And if you were involved in a club, you had a leadership position in that club, we want to include it here. I know I get a lot of questions about including GPA and test scores. Um, it's a pretty simple answer here. If you've got a great GPA in the context of your university, put it on your resume. Um, Now, if you are somebody that maybe didn't get as desirable a GPA, or whatever the equivalent might be in your university education, um, you know, there's few options you can take. It's not necessary to include it on the resume, but if it's less than desirable, I would recommend using the optional essay that's part of the application, to explain anything that might have been a result of that low GPA, if there were some circumstances that contributed that, but if you made an effort to bounce back or show demonstrated improvement, you could use that optional essay as a mechanism to do that. But if you've got a GPA that you're proud of, put it on your resume. Um, Now, with test scores, with respect to the GMAT or the GRE or the LSAT, if you're applying to law school, the general guidance I would give is that if it is a blow away score, a top tier score, if you've got a 790 on the GMAT, highlight it on the resume. If you've got something that's maybe more of the middle tier, I'd probably leave it off. Hence, I mentioned some of the caveats. But uh, for the purposes of education, again, we want to prioritize what you studied, where you studied, and more of the campus involvement, scholarships, awards than, say, GPA and test scores. It's really those first two bullet points that we want to be capturing and highlighting. Work experience. So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we want to be going in chronological order from most recent to least recent. Um, Talking a little bit about earlier what I mentioned about leadership, I want to know what you did and where you demonstrated areas of leadership or driving outcomes and results. Um, I see a lot of bullet points or times where someone might say they worked in a team and the team did this, or the team drove an outcome, um, which, while not necessarily bad, uh, doesn't quite tell me more about what you did specifically or what you did to drive that outcome. And I see some questions in the chat. I will get to those once I get through the remainder of this slide, but appreciate everybody popping those in the chat. Okay, so the last part here, and again, I want to mention that there's some flexibility. I've seen, some people have just a skills and interests section. I've seen folks have a volunteer experience section as that third section. Depending on how rich your work experience and how much space you have, you might be able to get four distinct sections of education, work experience, skills and interests, or volunteer experience. It's a case by case basis, and when I work with clients, I advise them on that case by case basis. I wouldn't say there's one flat rule, but I will talk through some of the things that I would expect to see in these sections that might be a little bit different from your standard job resume. So, first point is around let's talk about volunteer experience. I like to treat this section very similar to work experience. So, if you're someone that has a rich history of volunteering or community service, tell me where you did it, tell me what your role is, and tell me what you did. Um, this is another area where you can exemplify or highlight instances of leadership. So, the last thing I'd want to see is you just list where you volunteered and that's sort of it. I'd like to hear a little bit more about these experiences. At the end of the day, a resume tells me or it gives me a peek behind the curtain at the story of you. And when admissions readers are looking through hundreds, if not thousands, of applications through every application cycle, um, the more of a clear picture they can get about you, the more remembered you might be from the perspective of a reader. Which takes me into the skills and interest piece. So this is often an overlooked portion of the resume. I've seen a lot of resumes where people list their interests and it's just likes cooking, enjoys reading. Doesn't tell me anything about you. Everyone hopefully likes reading. Hopefully most people like cooking, but it doesn't tell me about what you enjoy to read. It doesn't tell me about what you like to cook or what you like to eat. It's not really giving me a clear picture of anything about you. So I always like to use that section to actually expand and give a little bit more detail. What are some of your hobbies? Why do you get fulfillment out of those hobbies? Anything that's going to give me a more clear picture of who you are as a person, who you are as a more well-rounded candidate, is going to help highlight that. We'll touch on some examples in a little bit of what I'm talking about. So, coming to some questions in the chat, I see what would you consider to be a low GPA? Anything under a 3.5? Good question. It's not a bad rule of thumb to go. I wouldn't say anything less than a 3.5 by definition is a low GPA. There are some context dependent clues there. For example, um, you know, if you're coming from a top tier university and you're really difficult major, a 3.3 might be considered a really good GPA. I wouldn't say there's an exact rule of thumb. There's a little bit of use your best judgment. And it's also school by school dependent. I know, particularly for some international universities that might not operate on a 4.0 scale, it's going to be a little bit dependent there. If your school does any sort of like Latin honors, for example, if you were cum laude or summa cum laude, it's another good rule of thumb to offer. But certainly anything above a 3.5, I would say, is worth mentioning. But I also wouldn't say that anything below a 3.5 is an automatic disqualifier either. It's, again, a little bit more of a case by case basis there. Another question: would you recommend adding work certificates slash licenses such as SIE, Series 7, etc.? Great question. The answer is absolutely. And I'm going to touch on a couple examples of what not to include, but anything that's specifical, anything that you've got some sort of tangible documentation or paperwork that speaks to your accomplishment, we absolutely want to highlight it on the resume, particularly anything like a Series 7, or if you're a CPA or CFA, or Lean Six Sigma, PMP, anything like that. We want to make sure we highlight it. Shows that you're willing to invest in your education, for invest in your intellectual and professional development as well. Okay, another question here. Two questions. Should an MBA resume be one page if you have less than 5 years of work experience? And do you recommend putting the education section above work experience? To answer the second question, putting the education above work experience, there's no right answer. I think a lot of candidates tend to put work experience first and then education. But I wouldn't say it really matters. If you want to put education first and then work experience second, you're not going to be dinged as a result of that. With respect to an MBA resume being one page if you have less than 5 years of work experience, I would say the general rule of thumb is your MBA resume should be one page regardless. So, overall caveat for your resume, and I think this is mostly true for most job resumes as well, with the exception of those who have at least more than 10 years of experience and a more detailed CV, your resume should be one page. Some schools may have very specific guidelines on page length, borders, width, general formatting. You want to make sure you're looking at those. I think the last thing you want to do is be just looking at the resume guidance the night before the application deadline. So, check with the school, check what the application guidelines are. But the general rule of thumb is your MBA resume should be one page. See a question here about what about additional info such as personal interests, work eligibility, high school work experience, etc. Um, if you are a recent graduate, like in the last year or two, high school experience might be relevant, but generally speaking, for the purposes of an MBA resume, I would say we're focused more on internships and full-time work experience than high school experience. Personal interests, I think I just touched on that. We certainly want to be able to highlight as well. What can be included in the optional essay? I'm not going to go into too much detail about that because it's not really the focus of this session, but the optional essay of most applications is typically reserved for unique circumstances that you would want to explain in your background. What I would say you don't want to use this essay for is like sending another essay for the sake of sending another essay. Like if you want to send like poetry or like tell you another story about your life, I would not recommend doing that. Admissions committees are really busy. The last thing they want to do is be reading another essay that they didn't assign. The purpose of an optional essay would be explaining things like an uncharacteristically low GPA, if you've got a gap in your resume or had to take time off work for some reason, anything that might further illuminate your background. Another scenario, and hopefully this is not the case with most of you, if there's criminal history to be explained, that's where you want to leverage the optional essay. Should we leave off SAT? Yes. Generally speaking, anything for high school, I don't think would be relevant for the purposes of an MBA resume. Should we put projects done in school and during work? Um, sure. I think if it's a project at work that's relevant to demonstrating your leadership experience, absolutely. If it's a project at your university that led to some specific outcome, I've seen people list participating in hackathons or incubator type events where that led to funding, then absolutely want to make sure that we highlight that. Dean's List something good to mention? Absolutely. List the years when you made Dean's List. I see some question. I see a question here about the differences between the MBA and the job resume. We did just touch through them, and I see some folks chiming in on the chat, so appreciate the team effort there. And I do understand a recording of this will be sent out later. So, in the interest of time, we're just gonna keep it moving. All right. Want to touch on some examples here of good versus not so good resume content. So starting with the bullet points in red, these are examples of less than optimal bullet points. Green are those similar bullet points made better. So just to take the first one here, um, if I see a bullet point that says designed a tool for a client that was adopted by most of the customer base, sounds interesting. What did you do? What type of client was it? What does most of the customer base mean? When you say designed, what were the steps taken there? Kind of tool. So you can see here, it sounds like we have the building blocks of a good bullet point. Sounds like you did something really cool, just not really telling me too much about it. Looking at the second bullet, worked in a team to solve a client's cost optimization challenge, which resulted in $25 million in annual savings. We have a good quantifiable outcome, which is great. It says you worked in a team. What was your role in that team? Were you the leader of that team? Were you more of an individual contributor? If you had a specific role, what actions did you take to help solve this challenge? Specifically, when we say cost optimization, um, another thing that I see, particularly for folks, um, you know, coming from more of a consulting background, is I see like jargony things like uh, corporate strategy, cost optimization, synergies, data analytics. They sound good, but they lack specificity. So we want to be a little bit more specific. So let's take a look at the first green bullet here, which is essentially a rewording of the first bullet. It tells me you led a team of 10 to develop a new customer access portal for a leading insurer, which resulted in an 85% conversion rate increase. This is a much better point. I see you've got a leadership role. You led a group, so you know what it's like to lead a team of at least some degree. I have an example of what type of client you're working with, and it sounds like it was ultimately successful. There might be some slight room for improvement here, but this is more in the vein of the type of bullet points that we want to see. Now, and similar for the last point. Now, one question that I get asked a lot is like, Does every bullet point have to have a quantifiable outcome? The answer is no. Um, I know a lot of folks who might come from the world of finance or the world of sales. It's a little bit easier to quantify outcomes. Well, for a lot of folks, I'll tell you as an example. I came from a consulting background where, I was working on more longer term projects where you don't have an immediately like juicy quantifiable bullet point. But that's okay. That doesn't mean there aren't opportunities to highlight where you demonstrated leadership or you demonstrated a new approach to solving a problem. There's still opportunities to do that. It's case by case and a bullet point by bullet point basis, but not every bullet point has to have an exact number behind it. I want to make sure I clarify that first. Okay, before I walk through this resume in the screen, I see there's a couple more questions in the chat, so I'm going to try and cover a few of them best I can. Okay, let's see. I think we left off here about let's see, I'm scrolling through. What should have more weight? Client employer prestige or project outcomes? Um, that's an interesting question. I think I might answer it going through this resume walkthrough, but I wouldn't say that's necessarily the right question to ask. I think what we should be asking more is, you know, I'm interested more in experiences of where you kind of demonstrated leadership, where you drove outcomes, where you were impactful to your team and organization. Um, so the answer is that could fall in the domain of project outcomes. That could fall in the domain of client employer prestige. I wouldn't say it's necessarily comparing those two. It might fall under a bit of both. Okay, and I see here in context to the previous bullet point, would it be worth mentioning how the model led to a discovery of $25 million in savings? Yes, absolutely. And I would call out like that point was really more for illustrative purposes, but yes, any point with you know space as needed on this on the resume where you can show me the specifics of how you did something, the better. But good question. All right. Another question here. How many bullets max can I have per experience? I wouldn't say there's a finite number. General rule of thumb is I would try not to go beyond six, but a better rule of thumb that I've always learned is that bullet points come in pairs at a minimum. So what I don't want to see is you've got an example of work experience and there's one bullet point on it. There should at least be two. Generally speaking, no more than 5 to 6 would be a good rule of thumb, but good question. All right. See, question here. If you lead a team, can you speak to team achievements or should you speak to individual? That's a good question. I think I sort of touched on it here. I am more interested in your role within the team, but if your role in the team contributed to a team's outcome, we certainly want to highlight both. So I guess the short answer is both. If you were the project manager of a team that drove the group's findings or at least led the group to a realization that your client or your customer could save $1 million a year. That's a team outcome, but you had a specific role in that. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, the last thing here. So I've got a sample resume up on the screen, and there are some things in this resume that work well, and there are some things that don't work so well. So I'm going to talk through each of the sections and highlight some of the things that hopefully are accumulated from what we've been talking about earlier. So let's start up with, actually, we'll start from the very top of your name. And I also want to mention, this is not the this is a best practice template. This is not, if you want to switch around headings, if you want to use different font, if you want to have a different structure, there's no one right answer. This is one potential template that I like to use, but again, it's there's a little bit of personal preference involved here, but want to take this mostly for illustrative purposes. Starting up, if we were to have a name area, one thing that I see a lot of folks do is they'll leave the hyperlink in around their LinkedIn or any type of website. Try to leave it off, um, especially for a lot of readers who might have their resumes printed. Including any links is generally not something you want to do in your resume. There's another example here. I've worked with a few people who've had links to like portfolios or websites that are hyperlinked into a specific word or term. You want to avoid that. If, let's say, you've got a website that you built that you want to draw a reader towards, you want to put the full URL in text in the resume rather than a hyperlink, again, for the purposes of um, your reader might have it printed out and wouldn't have access to it. I do see a question about having your LinkedIn in your resume. If you've got one and it's professional, I always think it's a best practice to include your LinkedIn. It's another way for your reader to vet your profile, see a little bit more about you. If there's some additional information there that's worth calling out, so would absolutely recommend including your LinkedIn if you have one. Um, that's another best practice. Okay, coming to the education section. For graduation date, couple things here. You might notice there's some inconsistency. With the Master of Science and Economics degree, it looks like we've got an end date. With the bachelor's degree, we've got the start and end dates. Best practice is you for graduation is just include your graduation date, not necessarily the time span, the 4 years, the 2 years, or whatever. Just tell me the end date when you graduated. Saves a little space. Looks a little bit more clean. Another caveat I wanted to call out here, and this is more from a formatting perspective. Make sure you're consistent when using any type of abbreviations or acronyms. For example, we see fully spelled out Master of Science in Economics here, and then BA in Economics here. If you're going to spell out your degree, make sure it's consistent. So if you want to say Master of Science in Economics, give me Bachelor of Arts in Economics. If you want to say MS in Economics, make sure it's BA in Economics. Whatever you decide to do, just be consistent. Similarly here, when we talk about GPA, we see a 3.6 out of 4.00. This is also going to sound very nitty gritty, but very important. Be consistent with number of digits. If it's a 3.60 out of 4.00, make sure we're including that last additional digit. Or if it's a 3.67 out of 4.00, make sure you're consistent. Okay. Couple other things. Somebody asked a question earlier about Dean's List. Again, make sure you call that out here if you made it. Just list the years. I wouldn't necessarily go into semesters, just the years. Now, let's talk about work experience. I think from a formatting standpoint, it's pretty straightforward. I did want to call out one potential idea you can include in your resumes. This is by no means a requirement, but I think it's a nice thing to add if you've got the space and you feel like it's relevant to your resume. But again, I want to make sure I'm clear. This is by no means a requirement, but I do think it's a nice to have. I call it a sub headline. And that subheadline in question would be this italicized text here. So, director in mega corporations, corporate strategy division supporting X initiatives, realizing and Y $1 million in annual revenue growth. Here's why I like a subheadline. I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation that one of the differences between your job resume and your MBA resume is that a job resume will often read like a job description, just telling me what you did, which may be relevant for your industry if you're applying for another job in that industry. However, for the purposes of your admissions reader who might not be familiar with your industry, if you give them a bunch of bullet points that are loaded with industry specific jargon, industry specific acronyms, uh, your reader might really have no sense of what it is that you actually do, which is where I think a one line, subline, headline can come in play, or subheadline, rather. Sorry. Just a quick one line descriptor of what your role is within that company. So here, for example, if I'm an admissions reader and I have no idea what mega corporation is or what a director actually does, you can say, hey, as director, I support uh, healthcare initiatives that realize $25 million in annual revenue growth, something like that. So as a reader, I can go, okay, now I have a little bit of context for the actual meat of their experience that's going to help me understand a little bit more about what they did. So when I'm going through the experience and I can get a sense of what type of leadership role they have, I have that additional level of context. Now let's talk about some areas that maybe don't work so well here in this example. So I see duties include leading multiple projects and teams to help deliver optimal strategic outcomes that deliver enterprise value for Megacorp. It's exhausting to read. Optimal strategic outcomes that deliver enterprise value. That's saying a whole lot of nothing in so many words. Leading multiple projects and teams. What kinds of projects? What kinds of teams? How big are your teams? When you say deliver outcomes, what type of outcomes are we talking about? Deliver enterprise value. What does this mean? So I include this bullet here partially from a humor perspective, but also partially to illustrate A frequent mistake that I see in a lot of resumes is we just overload it with buzzwords that don't tell me anything about what you did. Another point from a formatting perspective, you can see how this first bullet point here, it just bleeds over into a second line, and we've got the three words for megacorp taking up an entire horizontal line of real estate on your resume. This is not making efficient use of your resume and the space on your resume. My general rule of thumb that I'd like to advise is that each bullet point, in terms of horizontal space across the resume, should be occupying at least 85% of the horizontal space. So if I see a bullet point like this last one here, where it's three words or four words, whatever, that's telling me you've got a lot of room to expand. If I see a bullet point like this one, where we've got an entire line of text being occupied and then a little bit, it tells me there's either room to consolidate and get that onto one line, or expand on that second bullet point further to get you more space across the page. So I did want to call that out. Let's look at the last bullet point here. President's Club, 120% CLV. I see this a lot, particularly folks who have more of a finance or sales background. So you might see things like 80% OTE, President's Club, Sales Leader of the Year. Great. Uh, what did you do to get that? What does that tell me? What is CLV? What are all these things? They sound like accomplishments, which is great, but what actions did you take to achieve those outcomes, to realize those accomplishments? I'm more interested in I think there was a question in the chat that mentioned the how, and that's exactly it. I want to see the how. What were the steps that you took to make President's Club? How many people were in the running for President's Club? Were you one of five that were selected? Were you one of 400? Again, showing that sense of scale, showing the steps that were taken, the actions, etc., is going to strengthen your resume. There's a couple of other examples here. I know in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each one, but let's see, highlighting an example of a good bullet point. Let's take the last bullet point under ABC Consulting. Actually, no, we actually want to go more. Actually, let's go with the one under associate, because that was actually an example of one I didn't want to see. So under associate, we see developed a workforce optimization model in Excel to solve for a client's annual turnover challenges, which contributed to more accurate retention insight and resulted in a 20% reduction in annual attrition. This is an example of a good meaty bullet point. I have a sense of what you did, what tool you used, what the problem you were trying to solve is, and what the outcome was, and what value that was realized for your client. Again, this context might be different depending on your work experience, but the basics are there, and this should be consistent regardless of what you did and what type of industry you work in. Tell me about a time when you were solving a problem or trying to solve a challenge. What were the steps you took? What was the outcome? Or what result was achieved? So again, thinking more about that STAR method. Last thing I want to touch on here are the skills and interests. So we talked about this a little earlier, but I wanted to illustrate some other examples of where you can beef up your resume. When I see things like interested in coding, likes cooking, what are you interested in coding? Have you built your own website? Do you have like a portfolio that you can include the URL to? Do you have any specific coding languages that you're certified in? Did you teach yourself Python? Did you teach yourself CSS or SAS or something else? Do you like to cook? How often do you like to cook? What do you like to cook? I think I had on my resume for my application that my favorite thing to make is my grandma's meatball recipe every Sundays, and that was called out in one of my interviews. Um, Give me a little bit more detail about yourself. These are the types of things that are going to provide a more complete picture of you. Don't just overlook this section. I can't tell you how many resumes I see where people just say they like hiking, they like reading, they like trying new restaurants. It's kind of forgettable. Tell me a little bit more. Another thing I'll mention, because this is another question I get, is around I see a lot of people who will put like proficient in Microsoft Suite or proficient in Word, PowerPoint, Excel. I will say this. I think the baseline expectation, if you're applying for business school, particularly an MBA, is that you have some facility with Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. My advice is do not put it on your resume. We want to leave any type of software for more specific certified or licensed experience, not things like Microsoft Word. Hopefully at this point, you guys have all opened a Word document or printed a document or typed a document, made a slide, built a spreadsheet, did something. Don't waste space on your resume listing things like that out. Another general area, and this is a personal preference, but I really don't like when folks will put in a skills or an interests section and then put things like data analytics, project management, or strategy, or like leadership. Again, doesn't really tell me anything. If I'm looking through, I would expect these types of skills to be evident in your body of work experience. Don't tell me at the very bottom of your resume that you're interested in project management. If you're interested in project management and you're good at it and you want to highlight it, and that's evident in your work experience, put that in your work experience. Don't leave it as a throwaway two words at the end of your resume that consume space that might otherwise be taken by a more substantive bullet point. So again, just a couple of examples here to offer some, some good aspects of a resume and some things that aren't as great. So hopefully you all have a better visual understanding of some of the things we were talking about earlier in the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of the additional questions here in the chat that popped up as I was going through. So I'll make sure I get to everything here. Um, I see just please fix. Thanks. Not really sure what that's referring to. Um, okay, so I see this is, it looks like in reference to the sub headline. In other words, the italicized text is, whoops, it keeps jumping around. Keep losing the chat here. 1 second. What you did in the bullet points are the specific achievements. Yeah, I think that's generally a good understanding of the subheadline. I think the subheadline is just a one sentence description of your role, and the bullet points tell me a little bit more about those specific instances of substantive experience that we talked about. So yes. Okay, then I see here thoughts on the use of AI to help craft word, tweak your experiences, and help drive home your impacts. I really appreciate this question, and I'm going to be as blunt and transparent as possible. Do not use any type of AI platform for your resume, for your resumes, for any part of your application. I think most business schools at this point have AI detection software that can tell if you're using any type of platform like ChatGPT. I, as a coach, have no interest in reading some computer tools words or some computer tools use of formatting on your resume. So just for compliance reasons and just for quality of your application, I do not recommend the use of AI. And to be perfectly honest, I've read and unfortunately seen instances of folks who have used AI in terms of their essays. And I can tell you right now, it is very easy to tell the difference between what a human wrote and what a service like ChatGPT wrote. So not to sound too hard headed on that, but I pretty straightforward. Do not use an AI platform. Okay. Going through here. Let's see. Okay. How detailed should the skills interests be? I think talking through that, again, we want to be mindful of real estate on the page. But, generally speaking, if there's any type of, if you've got community service or volunteer experience worth highlighting, you could use it there. If you've got specific certificates or licenses and any type of, language, software tool, you can include it there. Then give me a sense of what type of hobbies or interests you have outside of work and school. So again, I wouldn't overthink this section, but give it the requisite amount of thought. What is the ideal time frame to work on an MBA resume? Well, I think it's going to depend on what application round you're looking at. So, if you're looking at a round one application, typically early fall, um, I advise that you want to have your full application package probably at least, 2 weeks or so before that deadline. But I wouldn't say there's no one right ideal time frame, but certainly would not recommend leaving it until the last week before your applications. I would say you want to give yourself enough time to really put a lot of thought into your experience thus far. And I always tell clients that I work with to when they're working on their first draft of their resume, just get everything out there. I don't care if it's 2 or 3 pages. I'd rather start with everything and whittle down than start with nothing and try and build up. So you want to give yourself that time to get everything down on paper, give yourself a little bit of a break, read it again with fresh eyes, make use of people like coaches on the platform here at Leland or friends as a second set of eyes. But those types of methods can always help. Okay, I see here. Any tips for transferring military skills or experiences? Um, guess I'm not really sure what we're trying to ask here specifically in this question, but have worked with a number of clients in the past that have military experience. But I guess the short answer would be you want to treat your military experience like your work experience if that's relevant. Um, the I think the approach shouldn't change. Could you summarize key differences between job resumes and MBA resumes? Any pitfalls to avoid in the interest of time? And given that covered that earlier in the presentation, I'm not going to address that, but should be part of the recording here. How can you compensate for limited volunteer community service? Um, it's a good question, and certainly wouldn't expect that every single applicant has, tons of volunteer and community service. But, um, you know, case by case basis, it means learning a little bit more about your background. If you have a specific hobby that you like to invest your time in, take the time to call it out there. If you have specific interests that are worth noting. So I've worked with a number of people who, for example, are interested in um, Bollywood movies or Bollywood type dancing and take classes outside of work. Those are types of things that you can mention. If you're interested in yoga and you like to teach yoga, those are the types of things that you can call out in lieu of volunteer and community services. Lean into more of your hobbies and interests. Would you recommend adding upcoming experiences? Um, Not really sure what we're getting at with the question there. I think the goal with a resume when you're submitting it is that it's more point in time and historical than anything that's upcoming. So I guess the short answer would be no, but again, I think would be more of a case by case basis. For a senior consultant, not manager, how would you make up for leadership in a resume? So I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wouldn't say leadership boils down to just having like direct reports or managing team. Like you can demonstrate leadership in a number of different ways. For example, I think for most of my career as a consultant before I moved up the ladder, I was in more of an individual contributor type role within a team, but I took responsibility to take lead on a deliverable, or I came up with a different approach to how our team operated, or came up with a unique idea to solve a problem our team was working on. Um, or I leaned into an opportunity to mentor new hires. These are examples where you can demonstrate leadership beyond just a title or having team members that report to you. But a good question. If you are planning to apply round one this fall to enroll fall 2025, would you say now is too late to get involved in volunteer opportunities? I think the short answer is no. I would say hopefully if you're pursuing volunteer experiences, that these are things that you're passionate about and that you're interested in. We certainly don't want to just add things to the resume for the sake of adding them. But no, I don't think it's too late. Starting in May and it gives you through August. That's several months to get some good quality volunteer experience. So no, I don't think it's too late. Okay. No, we're running a little bit over here. So wanted to just call out a few items here at the end. Again, mention that got a discount here for 5% all my services. That code will expire next Friday. So make sure that if you want to take advantage of it, you do it sooner rather than later. I am available for one on one coaching. I know link to my profile was included earlier in the chat. I've got a few different offerings. I have a package that is just specifically focused on your resume. It's an area of expertise of mine, and I've had a lot of satisfaction and enjoyment of working with a number of different clients and success working with those clients on just their resume. I have a package just focused on essay preparation and review, and then a comprehensive package for the entire suite of the application. So that's everything from your essays to your resume to letters of recommendation to other components of your application as well, interview prep, etc. So, hopefully look forward to hearing from some of you who are interested in working together. I am open. And I know that round one will be coming up here sooner rather than later. So would hopefully love the opportunity to work with as many of you that are interested. So I want to thank you again for taking the time to join the session. Hope it was valuable. And for those of you that are going to be applying soon, best of luck in your applications going forward. Thanks, everyone.